Inside a Washington State hospital in 2003, a young woman was about to give birth, and she was extremely nervous. But not just because she was going to have a baby for the first time. A court officer stood just a few feet away from her, and her eyes never left the expectant mother. And as soon as the baby was born and its umbilical cord was cut, that officer quickly took a vial of the mother and child's blood and then immediately raced out of the room. What that vial contained could save this mother's family, or it could send her to prison. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you liked today's story, please replace the Follow Button's mouthwash with hot dog water. Today's episode is called Chimera. On a cold gray morning in December of 2002, 26-year-old Lydia Fairchild stepped out of her modest apartment in Richland, Washington. Her thick reddish-brown hair was tied back in a ponytail, and there were dark circles under her blue eyes. Lydia had not slept much the night before because there was a lot on her mind. She and her longtime boyfriend, Jamie Townsend, had just broken up again. Their relationship had been through many ups and downs over the last several years. They loved each other, but lately they just couldn't seem to get along, and so they had finally decided to just end things. It was a tough situation, especially because they shared 2 kids, a 2-year-old boy and a 1-year-old girl. And things had become even more complicated because Lydia had recently found out that she was pregnant again. Lydia walked off the front steps and headed to her car, trying her best to ignore her overflowing mailbox. She didn't need to look at what was in her mailbox to know it was a whole bunch of bills that were all past due. The bills were another reminder of how challenging life had become lately. She was newly single, pregnant, and also unemployed. While Richland, Washington was a comfortable and safe place to call home, trying to find a job there had been a struggle for Lydia, and her savings were now running low. But she did have one thing she was counting on to keep her going. Several weeks ago, she'd applied for welfare benefits, and this morning, she finally got a phone call about her application. Lydia thought everything had been approved, but the person who called her said there was a problem and she would have to come down to the office to talk about it. And so that was where she was going this morning. So Lydia got into her car, and she drove to the social services department a few miles away. Meanwhile, the social worker who had called Lydia waited for her in his office. Sitting next to him was his colleague, a woman dressed in a conservative dark blue suit. Neither of them said very much. They were too focused on studying Lydia's case file. The two of them had seen hundreds of welfare applications over the past few years, but never one like Lydia's, and so they were very curious to see what she would have to say. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door, and Lydia entered. Once she sat down, the social worker who had called her got right to the point. There was a problem with the DNA tests that Lydia and her kids had submitted in order to receive these welfare benefits. The results showed that Lydia was not actually the children's mother. For a long moment, Lydia didn't say anything. Then she let out an awkward laugh and told them there had to be some mistake. But the social worker shook his head. DNA testing had a 100% accuracy rate. Lydia just sat back in her chair with this look of total disbelief in her eyes. And it was at this point the social worker's colleague, who was dressed in the dark blue suit, finally spoke up and introduced herself. She told Lydia she was not a social worker, she was a lawyer, and she was with the prosecutor's office. The lawyer got right to the point. Lydia had clearly committed welfare fraud. She had claimed children that were not hers as dependents on her welfare application, and this was a serious crime. And so the lawyer asked Lydia point blank if she was trying to pass these kids off as her own in order to collect a higher welfare payment. And Lydia said no, of course not. Then the lawyer suggested that Lydia must have stolen someone's identity, but Lydia immediately pulled out her driver's license, which had her name on it and all of the information she had included on her application, and Lydia promised the license was real. Lydia insisted that her kids were her natural-born children. She claimed she even had proof since she had their birth certificates and the baby's footprints from the hospital. The lawyer flashed a worried look over at the social worker. Technically, they both knew it was possible that Lydia could have given birth to these kids without actually sharing their DNA, but that could only happen if she was a surrogate mother. And the social worker realized that if that was the case, that could open up a whole other set of very dark possibilities. Lydia could have been paid to be a surrogate, and then when she actually delivered the kids, she could have kidnapped them from their real mother. If that was the case, this situation could go beyond welfare fraud. The real mother could be out there somewhere desperately looking for her kids. Or even worse, perhaps the mother was harmed. The social worker cleared his mind and tried to stay objective. Lydia's horrified reaction to all of their questions made it hard to believe that she was some hardened criminal. But the best scammers could be great actors. And in his career, the social worker had seen plenty of criminals put on Oscar-worthy performances. Finally, after Lydia continued to deny that she had done anything wrong, the social worker and the lawyer told her that she was free to go. But as she gathered her things, the woman from the prosecutor's office gave her a dire warning. Prosecutors were preparing a criminal case against her, and they could take her kids at any moment. Lydia's hands were shaking as she drove home from the interview. She didn't know what to think. All she knew was that she had to get home and figure out what to do next. Lydia rushed through the front door of her apartment and called her mother, Carol. Carol tried her best to calm Lydia down, reminding her that the stress would not be good for her current pregnancy. Lydia promised she would try to relax, and admittedly, it did make her feel better just to talk to her mom. After they hung up, Lydia took a deep, calming breath and then started looking for evidence that could help prove her side of the story. She dug up the children's medical records and birth certificates. She grabbed photos of her with the babies. Then she set it all aside to present to the prosecutor. She was sure it would convince the authorities that she really was the real mother. The next day, about 600 miles away, inside of a prison in Montana, an inmate was lying on his bunk bed. The gray-haired 50-year-old man looked up when he heard the familiar sound of a guard rapping on the bars. The guard told him that someone named Carol was calling him. The inmate's name was Rod Fairchild, and he was Lydia's father. Carol was Lydia's mom and Rod's ex-wife. If she was calling, Rod knew it meant something was wrong. Rod sat up and followed the guard to the prison's call center. The moment he picked up the receiver, he could tell that Carol was very upset. She told him everything that was happening to Lydia, that she was in trouble over a DNA test and was now being accused of committing welfare fraud. Rod told her to stay calm and that he was sure there must have been some mistake, and he was positive it would all get cleared up soon. But after the call ended, Rod dropped the optimism he had shared with Carol. As he headed back to his cell, he couldn't help but think about the DNA evidence. He wanted to believe his daughter, but he knew DNA didn't lie. And if she tried to fight DNA evidence in court, he was afraid she would lose. As her father, Rod felt terrible about the whole situation, and he even felt a little bit guilty. After all, he was serving time for business fraud, and now his daughter was in trouble over welfare fraud, and so he knew he had not set a great example for his child. Either way, Rod wondered if his daughter had gotten herself into trouble and was now trying to cover it up. The following week, the prosecutor, who was now in charge of Lydia's case, was busy building a case against her. He had to be absolutely certain that there had not been an error with Lydia's DNA test. Although it was highly unlikely, Lydia's samples could have been accidentally switched with someone else's, or maybe they had been tainted somehow. So just to be safe, he ordered Lydia and her kids to come in and submit 3 more DNA samples for testing. It took a few months to process the tests, But sometime around March of 2003, the prosecutor had his answer, and it was exactly what he expected. The prosecutor phoned Lydia to tell her the results. According to this second round of testing, Lydia was still not the children's biological mother. Lydia insisted these results were wrong too, and she began to argue with the prosecutor. She asked if the authorities had seen the birth certificates, the baby footprints, and all the photos of her with the kids. The prosecutor told Lydia that yes, they'd seen them, but it didn't matter. Nobody was denying that she gave birth to the kids. They're denying that they are her kids. At this point, the authorities were convinced that Lydia was running some sort of surrogacy scam. With the newest rounds of DNA tests in their hands, they had everything they needed to convict Lydia. The prosecutor informed her she'd be receiving a court summons and advised her to hire a lawyer. Lydia hung up from the prosecutor in a total daze. She knew she was in deep trouble. Lydia didn't have any time to waste, so she pulled out a phone book and started going through the yellow pages looking for family law attorneys. She explained her situation to each one, but they all said the same thing. There was no sense in fighting DNA evidence, and so none of the lawyers she contacted would agree to represent her. They knew they would lose. By the end of April, when Lydia was 8 months pregnant, she was a total nervous wreck and basically wasn't eating. She had to borrow money since she never got her welfare benefits, and she couldn't get a job because of all the legal trouble she was in. Her first hearing was in a few weeks, on May 16, 2003, and somehow she'd have to argue her case in front of a judge without a lawyer. On May 16, 2003, Lydia's case went to court. This was a preliminary hearing to determine what would happen to her kids while her case proceeded. The judge overseeing the hearing sat in his chambers, reviewing the evidence against Lydia. He thought it was the strangest case he'd ever seen. The prosecution wanted to put her son and daughter in foster care, and it was now up to him, the judge, to decide. He put on his robe and walked into the courtroom, curious to meet the mother. Lydia, who was now 9 months pregnant, struggled to stand up when the judge entered the courtroom. When the judge sat down, he took a closer look at Lydia. She looked ready to give birth at any moment. The judge asked Lydia when she was due, and she told him she was scheduled to be induced into labor in just 3 days. The judge thought about this. Taking the kids away from her at this point, even if they were not technically her kids, seemed unnecessarily cruel. And so he told Lydia that he was prepared to let her keep custody of the kids for the moment, but he had conditions. He needed her and the newborn baby to submit a fresh round of DNA samples. A court officer would literally be present for the birth of this third kid, and the second that baby was born, they would take its DNA to be tested. The following Monday, May 19, 2003, Lydia checked into the hospital. She was induced into labor, and sure enough, the court officer who was in the room witnessed her give birth to a baby boy, who Lydia named Jamie II after her former boyfriend and the father of the baby. As nurses huddled around the newborn, the court officer tapped a lab technician on the shoulder. Before Lydia could hold little Jamie for the first time, the tech drew a vial of blood from the baby. He handed the vial to the court officer, who promptly turned and headed for the door. Before the officer left the room, she looked back for a moment. As Lydia now cuddled with her newborn son for the first time, it was hard for the court officer to believe that this woman was anything but a genuine loving mother. The officer looked down at the vial in her hand. It would prove whether Lydia was this baby's biological mother, or if she was really the scheming liar that prosecutors claimed she was. 2 weeks later, the results from Lydia and her new baby's blood tests came back. It showed that, once again, she and her child did not share any DNA, so she could not be the baby's biological mother. Prosecutors were more sure than ever that Lydia was in fact running some kind of surrogacy scam. Now Lydia was in even bigger trouble than before. And without a lawyer, she ran an even bigger risk of losing her case. 'Cause 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 Just a few days after Lydia's newest DNA results came back showing she was not the biological mother of her newest baby, a 41-year-old attorney named Alan Tyndall sat down at his cluttered desk with his morning coffee. He had a stack of paperwork that he was not looking forward to doing that day, so when his secretary patched through a potential client, he was happy to take the call. It was Lydia, and as Alan listened to her story, he wasn't sure what to make of her. Like any good lawyer, he knew DNA evidence was the gold standard. But Alan enjoyed a challenge. He was a proud military veteran and former public defender. He was used to taking on tough situations. Alan was especially curious about Lydia's most recent DNA test. To his knowledge, the only way a woman could give birth to a baby that was not hers was if she was a surrogate. But Lydia said she wasn't, and this child and the other two were really her biological children. Alan had never heard of someone successfully overturning DNA evidence, but he believed everyone had a right to legal representation, and somehow he believed that Lydia had to be telling the truth. And so he told her he would take her case. With Lydia's next court date looming, Alan got straight to work. He spent long nights at his office looking for any logical way to defend her, but he kept arriving at the same conclusion. There was no fighting DNA evidence. After several weeks, Alan was still no closer to finding a way to defend Lydia, until one morning, his secretary brought him a recent edition of the New England Journal of Medicine. It came with a note from a colleague. There was an article they thought could be relevant to Lydia's case. At first, Alan shrugged it off. Lydia's case was starting to make the local news because it was so unusual, and so as a result, Alan had been getting a lot of unsolicited advice from people who had seen her story on the news. But Alan was not making much progress on his own, so he picked up the thick journal and started to flip through it. And by the time he got to the end, his eyes were wide. He could not believe what he had just read. It was a long shot, but if what he had read was true, it could be the key to winning this impossible case. Alan's first step was to convince the judge to postpone the trial. He explained that Lydia needed to undergo more in-depth testing to try out this new theory he had, and it could take months to get the results. The judge agreed to delay the court date until April of 2004, nearly a year away. Alan was confident that would give them enough time. And so right away, he sent Lydia off to lab after lab where she underwent a battery of tests. Then they waited. Almost a year went by, and Alan was still waiting for the results, and the date for Lydia's hearing was fast approaching. One night, Alan was in his office working on his opening statement for Lydia's case when his phone rang. It was the doctor overseeing Lydia's lab work, and he told Alan he had some bad news. There was still too much data to analyze, and Lydia's test results wouldn't be ready in time for her hearing. Alan could not hide his disappointment. This was a huge setback, but he knew the judge wouldn't delay the trial any longer. And so, in April of 2004, Alan and Lydia walked into the courthouse where her trial would finally take place. Once they were seated, Alan leaned over to reassure her. Then he stood up and faced the judge. Alan didn't have the science-based evidence that he'd been counting on this whole time. What he had instead was a very strange story to tell, and everything in the whole case came down to whether he could get the judge to believe it. He began to explain why a schoolteacher who lived 3,000 miles away in Boston, Massachusetts, and who had never met or even heard of Lydia, could prove his client was innocent. That schoolteacher's name was Karen Keegan, and in the late 1990s, Karen was sick and needed a kidney transplant. Hoping her sons would be a match, they all took a DNA test. And just like Lydia, the results showed there was a 0% chance that Karen was the mother of her kids. But unlike Lydia, Karen was able to find out why. A Harvard doctor looked into her case and suggested an extremely bizarre scenario. Karen was something called a human chimera. This condition was named after a creature from Greek mythology who had a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail. So basically, it was several different animals rolled into one. When a woman conceives twins, it's because 2 eggs in her womb have been fertilized. On extremely rare occasions, the 2 eggs then fuse a few days after fertilization, and when that happens, the resulting embryo becomes one fetus with 2 different genetic codes. This is a human chimera. And once it's born, different parts of its body have unique strands of DNA. That explained why Karen Keegan didn't come up as a genetic match for both of her sons. The sample they had tested came from her other set of DNA. But then they tested different parts of Karen's body, her hair, her skin, even her bladder, and eventually they found DNA that did match her sons, and it came from Karen's thyroid gland. Allen argued that Lydia had to be a chimera too. Essentially, he was telling the judge that Lydia was her own twin. And because of this, samples may have been taken from a part of Lydia's body that had a different set of DNA than her kids'. Unfortunately, they still had not found any tissue within Lydia that matched her kids' DNA yet. But they did have something. Allen had gotten Lydia's mom tested, and that test proved that at least she, the mother, shared DNA with Lydia's children. That meant either Lydia or Lydia's sister had to be the kid's mother. The judge took a moment to digest the evidence. If all his years on the bench taught him one thing, it was that DNA tests were always right. But Allen's argument was very compelling. Then the judge made his announcement. He told the court he believed Lydia Fairchild was indeed the mother of these kids. In his opinion, the story of Karen Keegan, paired with the new DNA results of Lydia's mother, proved that Lydia had to be a human chimera. And so the judge dismissed Lydia's case and admitted that he was wrong. After almost 2 years, Lydia's ordeal was finally over. She burst into tears as Allen put his arm around her. She had been telling the truth, as crazy as it sounded, the whole time. A few months later, doctors were able to finally show that Lydia's DNA did match her kids'. They found the matching DNA from a cervical smear. Lydia Fairchild went down in textbooks as only one of 100 human chimeras ever identified. And while her ordeal would forever haunt her, it did bring her family closer together than they ever had been before. Lydia and her ex-boyfriend, Jamie Townsend, did get back together long enough to have a 4th child. This time around, because the world knew that Lydia was a human chimera, nobody questioned if she was the mother.
Mount Fuji is the highest mountain in Japan, rising up to 3,776 meters, and it's actually a volcano. It's dormant. The last time it erupted was in 1707, but geologists still classify it as active. Tourists are allowed to climb Mount Fuji, but only between July and September, because in the winter months, the mountain gets completely treacherous. There's snow and ice, and the wind picks up. It's very, very dangerous, so it's off limits. Now, thrill seekers, if they really wanted to, they could climb Mount Fuji in the winter, because there isn't a security guard posted up at the bottom of Mount Fuji checking people in and out. It's on you. If you want to climb it when it's off limits, well, then you're climbing at your own risk, because basically it's a terrible idea. But if you have the right equipment and you have all the right training, it is doable. One thrill seeker, a 47-year-old named Tetsu, decided he wanted to hike Mount Fuji in the winter of 2019. He wanted to live stream his entire journey to the summit. Now, Tetsu might have been a thrill seeker, but he certainly wasn't a mountain climber. He did not have the experience, nor did he have any of the equipment necessary for a climb up Mount Fuji in the winter. Wearing only street clothes and carrying nothing more than climbing poles and his smartphone, he turned on his live stream and he began hiking up the Shubashiri Trail. Viewers began tuning in as Tetsu happily made his way up this ash-covered trail, and then the ash turned into light snow, and then light snow turned into really heavy snow and ice and wind. And then Tetsu began complaining about how cold he was and how he couldn't feel his hands, and his viewers are egging him on to, keep going, keep pushing through it. And probably because of the pressure he felt from his viewers, he kept going when really this would have been the moment to turn around. When you're realizing that you don't have the right equipment and it's getting really cold and you're probably not even halfway up, That's the time to turn around, but he didn't. He pressed on. As he moved up the mountain, the path he was on continued to narrow and become increasingly more covered in ice, and the guard fence that straddled the side of this path was getting to the place where it comes to a stop, signaling the most dangerous section of the hike, which is the last leg up to the summit. He gets to that point where the fence comes to an end, and now he's on this narrow stretch where the wind is just whipping across and it's all ice, and he's trying to walk across the ice with this totally inappropriate footwear. He should have had on at least crampons, the metal spikes that go on the bottom of your shoe to grip ice. He just had tennis shoes on, and so he's slipping and sliding as he's walking up this icy trail, and then he finally staggers and falls, but he catches himself. And you can hear him laughing on the live stream, joking with his audience how dangerous and slippery it is. And his viewers begin to change their tone a little bit. And they're like, hey, you might want to consider turning around now. But Tetsu is totally focused on getting to the top. So he stands back up and he continues to kind of shuffle his way towards the summit on this stretch of ice. He finally gets right up below the summit to where on his live stream you can actually see the top of Mount Fuji. And you can tell that his footwear at this point is basically not able to handle how slick it is. He's basically constantly stumbling. And you can see he notices a little stretch of small rocks that seem to almost make stepping stones up to the summit. And he begins walking over very carefully on the ice to try to use these rocks to get himself up to the top. And right as he's trying to step for one of these rocks, he loses his balance. And on camera, he says, wait, I'm slipping. And then he falls and begins rocketing down the side of this mountain. Now, when you fall on a steep mountain, you have one, maybe two chances to self-arrest. So, for example, if you had an ice pick and you were like Tetsu and you start falling, you would want to roll over and dig the head of that ice pick into the ground and basically anchor your knees and elbows and drive everything you can into the snow to stop yourself from falling. And so if you can't do that in one or two attempts, your momentum will pick up and you'll be going too fast and you won't be able to stop yourself. And then you just gotta hope you survive the fall. Tetsu did not have an ice pick or any other tool to help him self-arrest, and he didn't have the training for what to do in a situation like this, so he didn't even attempt to roll over and dig his elbows or knees into the ground to try to slow down. So he just goes flying down the mountain, he's on his back, he's not slowing down, and he knows he's doomed. And he says on camera, well, it can't be helped, before he flies over the edge and falls hundreds of meters down to his death. His viewers who watched this happen alerted authorities, who found his body the next day over 1,000 meters away from where he had first fallen. Every year, there is a handful of people that attempt to climb Mount Fuji in the winter, and they meet the same fate.
Our next story is called Into the Wild.
On September 6, 1992, two moose hunters that were hunting just outside of Denali National Park in Alaska were walking up to a well-known landmark amongst hunters in the area. It was this old school bus that was parked in the middle of nowhere. It was all rusted over and nature had practically overgrown it. And hunters, trappers, and travelers would use this bus as kind of like a center point that you would reference where you were going relative to this particular bus. But when they walked up to it, they saw on the outside of the door that there was a note. Attention possible visitors, SOS, I need your help. I am injured, near death, and too weak to hike out of here. I am all alone. This is not a joke. In the name of God, please remain to save me. I am out collecting berries close by and shall return this evening. Thank you, Chris McCandless. Dated August ? 5 months earlier, in April of 1992, Chris McCandless, the one who wrote that note, had hitchhiked from Carthage, South Dakota to Fairbanks, Alaska. Once there, he hitchhiked again with an electrician named Jim Gallion who was making his way out of Fairbanks. Chris introduced himself as Alex and asked Jim if he would take him to Denali National Park, which was about 2 hours away to the southwest. On the drive, Jim asked Chris what he was going to be doing at the park, because this is like wild Alaska country, and frankly, Chris did not look like a rugged Alaskan outdoorsman. Chris told Jim that he was going to be living off the land for a few months. Jim would later say that he had serious doubts about Chris's ability to survive in the Alaskan bush. As it was, Chris only had a light backpack, he did have a rifle, but he really didn't have warm clothes on. He only had 10 pounds of rice. That was the only thing he brought for food. He didn't have a compass. He didn't have a map. He didn't have a watch. He just seemed totally ill-equipped for what he was saying he was going to go do. At some point, Jim tried to convince Chris not to go, or to at least postpone, and he even offered, hey, I'll drive you up to Anchorage and I'll buy you equipment. You need the right equipment for what you're going to be doing. Let's go there first. But Chris was stubborn, and so Jim ultimately relented and said, okay. He drove him to the park. Before Chris left, Jim actually gave him a pair of warm boots that he had in his truck. He said, here, you can use these more than I can. And Chris thanked him, took his boots, and he was on his way. Although Chris was planning for this extensive hike through Denali National Park all the way to the Bering Sea, Chris would only make it about 20 miles into his journey before stopping at an old rusted bus just outside of the park. Chris would live in this bus for 16 weeks, and according to his diary, that first week he was there was particularly rough. He was snowed in, he couldn't catch anything to eat, so he's hungry and cold. But shortly thereafter, he developed a routine. He was able to hunt successfully for some small game. He found some plants that were good to eat, and by and large, his entries made it seem like he was very happy. However, the last month of diary entries really painted a very different picture. After living in this bus for nearly 3 months, he indicated in his diary that he was kind of sick and tired of living off the land and he was ready to return back to society. So on July 3rd, he packs up his camp and he starts walking back the 20 miles towards where he came into the park in the first place. But when he came into the park 3 months earlier, the river that he was going to need to cross was frozen. And now that he's returning in the summer, it had thawed, and now it's the 75-foot wide raging river that was basically impossible to cross. And so he's trapped on the wrong side of this river. What he didn't know, because he didn't have a compass, he didn't have a map, he didn't know the area well, was there was actually a hand-operated tram that would take you across the river in the summer. It was only a mile away from his camp that was labeled on almost every map. In addition, there was a hunting cabin not far from that tram that's also on just about every map of this particular area. That had food, it had clothes, it had bedding. He could have stayed in this hunting cabin until conditions were okay again to make the journey back home. But again, he doesn't have a map, so he doesn't know these things exist. So at some point, he turns around and goes back to the bus, feeling totally dejected. That night, his journal entry just said, "Reined in, river looks impossible, lonely, scared." All of Chris's diary entries following his return to the bus after not being able to cross this river got shorter and bleaker and really painted a picture of a guy that was going downhill. The final entry in Chris's diary just says, "Beautiful blue berries." And then 19 days after his final entry is when those two moose hunters find this bus and see the note, the SOS note, pinned to the outside. The hunters go inside the bus, and there, laying in a sleeping bag, is the body of Christopher McCandless. Although it's not entirely clear how Christopher actually died, the two most common theories are either starvation or perhaps he ingested a poisonous plant seed. The hunters alerted authorities who came out and they launched an investigation, and during this investigation they found Chris's camera. Chris was an avid photographer. He had taken loads of pictures over the course of his stay out in the wild, and so he took one last dignified picture of himself before curling up in his sleeping bag and passing away.
Our next story is called One-Way Trip.
Bryce Gillies was born in 1989 in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. From a young age, Bryce's parents knew he loved the outdoors, and so they signed him up for the Boy Scouts. And as a scout, Bryce learned, amongst many things, how to survive in the wilderness. And he would routinely put this training to the test by leaving his house and heading off to the nearby Appalachian Trail and hiking around sometimes up to 20 miles in a single day. Bryce ultimately became an Eagle Scout, which is the highest rank anybody can obtain inside of the Boy Scouts, a rank that only about 8% of scouts will ever reach. After he graduated from high school in 2007, Bryce decided he wanted to go to school out west. And during a visit to Northern Arizona University, Bryce fell in love with their school because all around their campus were these unbelievable hiking trails that were totally unlike anything he saw growing up on the East Coast. Bryce decided this was his dream school, so he applied, and a couple weeks later, he got accepted. He was totally thrilled. During his first couple of years at NAU, Bryce took full advantage of these totally amazing hiking trails within a couple hours of the campus. He also spent some time overseas in West Africa, helping to build a medical clinic for people in need. During the summer break of 2009, so going into his third year at NAU, Bryce was still living out in Arizona in an apartment, and he still had a few weeks before classes started. And so he decided he would head off to the nearby Grand Canyon to do a little bit of hiking. He had recently read in an outdoor magazine about this lesser known but unbelievable trail that was just for experts in the canyon that he wanted to try. It was called the Deer Creek Thunder River Loop, and it brought hikers to this remote location where water gushed out of this huge limestone rock wall, transforming the desert landscape below into this unbelievable green oasis. The article said very strong hikers could complete this nearly 28-mile loop in about 3 days. Since Bryce considered himself a very strong hiker, he decided this was perfect for him. Bryce called his parents and let them know he was going to do this loop and that when he came back in a couple of days, he'd be making a trip to Virginia to visit with them. Then Bryce called some friends in the area to see if they wanted to come with him on this hike, but no one was available, so Bryce decided he would go on his own. So the next day, which was Saturday, July 18th, Bryce loaded up his car and he began driving these several hours to the parking lot that was nearest the trailhead. Bryce parked his car, he got his gear out of the trunk, and then he set off down the trail. Bryce had not obtained a backcountry permit for this hike. This was a requirement for anybody doing an overnight out in the canyon, which Bryce planned on doing. Bryce also didn't file his route with the park rangers. Had he told them where he was going, they would have tried to talk him out of it. The Deer Creek Thunder River Loop had no protection from the sun the entire time, and since it was July, he would be hit with the highest temperatures and the most direct sunlight. All this on top of the fact that even in the coolest times of the year, this trail is still an extremely difficult trail because of the terrain you have to navigate. In fact, when hikers did file their route with park rangers and they indicated they were going to be doing this expert loop, they would ask them to provide next of kin information in case they died during their hike. It's unclear if Bryce was just very confident in himself and his abilities, or if he was being reckless. From his car, Bryce hiked about 2 miles down some switchbacks into the canyon. Once he reached the bottom, he would have found himself in this wide open flat area called the Esplanade that kind of looked like the surface of the moon with all these potholes all over it. At this point in Bryce's hike, it would have been dark out, so he would have set up his tent somewhere on the rocks and camped out for the night. People that have done this, that have camped out on the Esplanade, have said it's unbelievably beautiful because most people experience the Grand Canyon from high up on one of the rims looking down into it. But the Esplanade is literally inside the canyon, so you have this unobstructed view in both directions, and apparently it's quite beautiful. The next morning, Bryce got up at sunrise, he packed up his campsite, and then he continued on his hike. The first challenge he would come up against that morning was navigating down what's called the Red Wall, which is a fairly steep and treacherous descent that for an experienced hiker, it would take about an hour to safely navigate. And then at the bottom of the Red Wall, you would enter into this area called the Surprise Valley. No one really knows why it's named that, but hikers who have been down in this valley, they think it's named after the surprise you feel when you get in there and you realize how much hotter it is. Typically, it's about 10 or 20 degrees hotter down inside of this bowl. After Bryce successfully navigated down the Red Wall, he entered into this totally miserable Surprise Valley, but he would have known he was only about a half-mile away from his target destination, the Deer Creek Thunder River, where he planned to jump in and cool off. So, eager to do that, Bryce took off, but made a critical mistake. He went the wrong way. While it's unclear exactly how this happened, experts believe his ears played a trick on him. Hikers are told as they're approaching this river in the middle of the desert, they should listen out for it, because when you get fairly close, you can hear the sound of rushing water. But hikers have to be careful because sometimes when the wind is blowing in a certain direction, that sound from the river will echo off the inside of this bowl and it will appear to come from the opposite direction. It's believed Bryce was following his map when he heard the sound of this river coming from a different direction, and so he abandoned the map and followed the sound. Bryce walked for quite a while in the wrong direction all the way up a hill, and most likely the whole time he was hearing the sound of the water, and he probably thought, once I get over the top of this hill, I'll look down the other side and I will see the water. But when he crested the hill, he looked down and just saw a barren valley. Had he continued another quarter mile down into the valley and then up the other side, he could have turned around and he would have been able to spot an obvious landmark that would have brought him to the river. But most likely, Bryce was exhausted from the extreme heat and the sunlight and trekking all this way, and so he felt like it was probably too risky to keep going down into this valley because he had no idea where it went. So in keeping with his wilderness training he got as a Boy Scout, he dropped all of his heavy equipment off the side of the trail in an area he had marked so he could eventually come back and retrieve it. And then he took his water, food, and headlamp, turned around, and began backtracking. After a little while, Bryce decided to abandon the trail and actually veer off onto a dry creek bed. In the Boy Scouts, they're taught any dry creek bed will eventually connect to water. And so at this point, Bryce is probably running low on water and figures whether this leads him to the Deer Creek Thunder River or some other water body, he didn't care. He just needed water. So off he went on this dry creek bed, but after a while, he saw less and less vegetation. It was just this barren desert in all directions. After a little while longer, Bryce dropped all of his gear on the ground after finishing his water. At this point, he would have known that if he doesn't find a water source soon, he won't make it. And so Bryce just continues to trudge along on this dry riverbed, not seeing any indication that he's getting any closer to water. But then he looks up and he sees the land in front of him appears to slope downward out of view. And then beyond that, he sees off in the distance what looks like the southern wall of the Grand Canyon. And below the southern wall is the Colorado River. And so Bryce would have known if he can just go down this decline, he's certain to reach this river and he'll be saved. And so Bryce made his way up to where the ground started going down towards the river, and he began safely descending fairly slowly, and then he reached a very steep section called a spill, which is a dry waterfall, and these vary in height, but they're pretty steep and they're pretty slick. Once Bryce went down one of these things, there'd be no way to get back up again. So this was a one-way trip. But Bryce was desperate. He knew his only chance was getting down to that Colorado River, which he could now see. And so Bryce scrambled down this first spill, and then he found another one, and he kept going down these spills, and they kept getting steeper and more challenging, and the temperature continued to rise as he went down deeper into this canyon. Finally, Bryce reached a spill that was very, very steep, and it was nearly vertical. But again, Bryce couldn't go back up the way he came, he had to keep going, so at some point he threw himself off of the spill and he fell down 30 feet, but he lived. He stood up, he dusted himself off, and he continued walking forward. He walked past these boulders into this clearing, and right in front of him is the Colorado River. It's a half a mile straight down in front of him. But the only way to get to it was navigating another spill. And this spill was 80 feet tall, and it was almost completely vertical. There was no way to survive that kind of fall. And Bryce couldn't just turn around and try to find an alternate route because this was a one-way trip. He could not climb back up the spills he had just come down to get there. And to his left and to his right were these steep canyon walls that kind of bordered the space he was in that had no handholds on them, so he couldn't climb them up or down. Bryce was trapped, and he knew it. The following Tuesday, when Bryce was supposed to be home in Virginia visiting his family, he didn't show up. So his family tried calling him, but they couldn't get through to him. It seemed like his phone was off, and so they called the authorities. A search party was sent out in the Grand Canyon to go look for Bryce, and on Saturday, July 25th, so this is 6 days after Bryce has found himself trapped on that ledge overlooking the river, a search party was on the Colorado River, and they happened to look up in the direction where Bryce had been, and they noticed what looked like a person, and so they got their climbing gear and they made their way up that spill onto this ledge, and they found Bryce. He was sitting up against a boulder, and he was deceased. He had died from heat stroke and dehydration. In his hand was his BlackBerry cell phone. It wouldn't have had any service inside of the canyon, but Bryce used it as a notepad to write a final message to his family and to his friends. In it, he writes, "Life is good whether it is long or short. I was fortunate to do much more than most people, and for that I am very thankful." His message also had some humor thrown into it. He said to his family that he was really thankful he had his BlackBerry phone because it would have been a lot harder to etch his final message into a rock. He also said that he didn't know what the afterlife held for him, he just hoped they had water. Then, with his phone's battery dying, he wrote one final sentence. "I feel like going into the wild is a calling we all feel. Some answer it, and some die for it." Then, shortly after writing that message, Bryce clutched his phone to his chest, and he passed away. He was just 20 years old.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Gates of the Arctic.
Growing up in Oklahoma, Blake Stanfield loved going out in the wilderness with his father, Neil. The pair were more like best friends than father and son, and they spent as much time together as they possibly could. But by the time Blake was in his 30s, he had become a medical doctor, and so he was really busy, and he was married, and he had a young kid, and so he didn't see his father very much. And then in 2003, when Blake was 38, he moved his family to Alaska, and so he really didn't see his father anymore. But shortly after moving, Blake had an idea. He wanted to surprise his dad on his 65th birthday with a rafting trip in Alaska. It was going to be this great way for the two to reconnect with each other. When he broke the news to his father, Neil was really touched by it and very excited, but at the same time, he was a little bit apprehensive, and he asked his son, are we going in a group? Is this going to be a guided rafting trip? And Blake said, oh no, that's the wrong way to do this. We will not have a good time if we go with a group. We're doing this alone. And so Neil said, well, isn't that a little bit risky, just the two of us out in the middle of Alaska? And Blake said, don't worry, I've picked a river that by Alaskan standards is considered leisurely, so we'll be just fine. Neil was still hesitant about it, but the two of them were very competent outdoorsmen, and so ultimately he just went along with it. So later that year, in early July, Blake and Neil took a float plane out to the Gates of the Arctic National Park in Alaska. This park is totally beautiful, but it's also very dangerous because it's full of grizzly bears and wolves, and it's also very remote. There's no people anywhere near this park. It's basically untouched wilderness. Adding to the isolation and danger, Blake and Neil did not have their cell phones or a radio. It was Blake's idea. He said it would be a good idea for us to just totally disconnect and just spend quality time together. And then also, Blake had chosen a starting point on this river that was situated basically right in the middle of the park, which meant it was 60 miles away from the nearest human settlement. So after they got dropped off by this float plane, and then the captain of that plane took off again, Blake and Neil loaded their stuff into their raft, and then they hopped in, and they started cruising down this river. At first, their trip was awesome. The weather was perfect, the landscape was beautiful, the water was totally calm, and Neil, he might have had reservations about the safety of this trip, but quickly he was overcome with just how peaceful it was, and how wonderful it was to be with just his son out on the open water. And in fact, Blake had intentionally booked this trip 2 weeks before the start of the official rafting season in Alaska, which meant really there was nobody else in the water. It was just those two. And they thought, wow, what luck. Except it turns out there's a very specific reason why the rafting season starts when it does in Alaska. Because that's the earliest the ice melts in the river and it becomes safe to travel on. After 2 hours of peace and tranquility out on this river, Blake and Neil started to notice these large ice chunks in the water ahead of them. And they were easy enough to get around, but as they kept moving, the current was picking up and these ice chunks got bigger and bigger until they started being these huge sheets all across the edges of the river where there was only a narrow strip of water they could travel through. And at some point, Neil asked Blake if it would be a good idea to just pull the raft over to the side of the river and get out and reassess the situation and see if we've reached an anomaly in the river where just this section is frozen, or if this is going to continue for a lot farther, and if so, we need to make alternative plans here. But Blake was not having it. He was stubborn, he wanted to keep going, and he was convinced he could maneuver the boat around the ice. And he said, let's just keep going a little bit farther. And so when they went a little bit farther, they reached a point where the current was so strong that they could no longer get out of the river. They had to ride it like a rapid until it stopped. And so as the father and son are fighting with each other about not having gotten out of the river while they still had a chance, they were not paying attention to what was in front of them, and they came around a corner and there was this huge ice shelf that was right across the whole river that basically blocked the whole path. And they turned at the last second. They couldn't do anything either way, but the nose of the raft went directly under the ice shelf and it flipped the raft onto its side, dumping Neil and Blake into frigid Alaskan waters underneath the ice shelf. And Blake would later say that he really believed that this was it. He didn't know how far this ice shelf was going to go on for, and so he assumed, I'm about to drown. But they managed to hit this air pocket inside of this ice shelf. The ice basically formed up at a bow, and they both happened to pop up into it, and they gripped onto the ice. And they're looking at each other, and they have no idea how long this ice shelf continues, but the current is pulling them, and they know it's just a matter of time before they get sucked under and go back under the ice. And so they look at each other, and they don't really know what to say, but it's kind of obvious that they think they're about to drown. And then at some point, Neil gets sucked under and swept away, and then Blake follows shortly after. And then fortunately, they only tumbled along for about 10 or 15 more feet before they popped up again. But much like the boat that could not paddle out of the river because of how strong the current was, Blake and Neil could not get out of the river in time before they hit yet another ice shelf. And the next ice shelf was much longer than the first. And so they knew it was going to happen. They grabbed onto the ice shelf and they're holding on and they're trying to pull themselves back out, but the current's too strong. And at some point, they each had to take a big breath and then let go and got pulled directly under the ice. And so the whole time they're pressing their face up against the underside of this ice in hopes they find an air pocket, but they don't. And so the whole time they're just desperately looking for air and they're bumping into the underside of the ice. They have no idea how long it's going to go on for. And so after what felt like an eternity, Blake finally gets shot out the backside of this huge ice shelf. And he's still in the river, but there's no more ice shelves in front of him. And the current had slowed down a little bit. So he was able to make his way to the edge and get out of the water. And he turned to face the water and his dad was nowhere to be found. And so Blake turns and he doesn't see his father coming out of the ice. He doesn't know if he's still under, if he came out again. And so he turns and runs downstream in hopes that he might have come out already. And sure enough, he found his dad clutching a rock in the middle of this river farther up. His head was badly bleeding, but he was alive. And so Blake grabbed a stick and was able to bring his father back into shore. Even though they had survived being pulled under the ice, they now had no equipment, no gear, no food, no water, no anything because it was pulled under the water. And they were soaking wet and becoming hypothermic. And they're in the middle of nowhere with no one nearby to help them. And no one's expecting them for a week. And no planes are going to be in the area for 2 weeks. Fortunately, Blake had a lighter in his pocket that worked, and so they were able to start a fire and stay warm, and they were able to scare away grizzly bears and wolves. Blake finally walked away from their campsite, which was up on a mountain, and he went down to this river where he was able to flag down a float plane that was not even scheduled to be in the area. It was just totally random, and they saw Blake, they came back, they picked him up, and both men were just fine. They did say that even though the trip was a complete disaster and nearly killed both of them, it did reconnect them in a way that few things could, and their relationship is good as ever. But they both say they will never go rafting again.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, not just this one, but also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform, and you'll find all of them. If you want to watch hundreds more strange, dark, and mysterious stories,